Well, welcome everyone. My name is Peter Cruchley, and before we start our anti-racism webinar sessions, I'm going to share some brief technical notes on behalf of the communications team running our events today. And so I'll share a slide just to explain how we're going to do this together. First of all, you'll see the webinar is being recorded, and it's going to be available soon after on the World Council of Churches YouTube channel, and there you can find more of these things and other events WCC and other organizations are running, so please check that out. And obviously in this session we're happy to answer any of our questions that we can, and we'll gather them through the Q&A box, and that will be the way to put them to the panelists. And if you have any technical issues, then you can use the chat box to raise those with the technical support team. So use the Q&A to raise questions for the panelists, and use the chat function to address technical issues to the team. Friends, thank you. We are going to move quickly into our work, but let me quickly also, on behalf of Council for World Mission, welcome you all both as panelists and as participants in this webinar. Council for World Mission is a mission organization formed in 1795. And we carry in our history and our life and our heart the legacies of slavery and the complexities and complicities of Christianity and colonization. And we have been addressing these in the last 40 years, but more recently in the work we've been doing, facing our own legacies of slavery directly and being challenged by them to become an agency that is committed to reparatory anti-racist action. So these webinars become a very important space for us to learn and to deepen our spirit and our commitment to this work. So all that the panelists are going to challenge and inspire us with, certainly, CWM is open, seeking to learn and discover how to change and transform itself into a mission organization committed to a vision of Christ as one who is deeply anti-racist. So friends, welcome, and thank you for the time you are sharing with us today. I'll pass over to Isabel.
Hey, thank you. Good day, everyone. On behalf of the World Council of Churches, Acting General Secretary, Reverend Professor Johan Sauka, it's a pleasure for me to welcome you to this conference on Anti-Racist in Christ, Ecumenical Christian Repentance, Reflection and Action on Racial Discrimination and Xenophobia. You may be aware that this conference was originally planned as an in-person conference in Geneva, but due to COVID-19 related travel restrictions, it is instead planned as a series of webinars around the essential themes of the conference. Racism and indigenous peoples are the thematic focus of the WCC Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace for the year 2021. Racism has been a concern of the World Council of Churches since its establishment in 1948. Recently, it has become a programmatic priority, I would say, going back to a decision made by the WCC Central Committee in 2016. Since then, we have had several activities to highlight racial justice, starting with racial justice solidarity visit to the US. And now the establishment of a transversal on overcoming racism, which starts on 1st of July, is WCC's effort to coordinate the work on anti-racism. This online event is one of the various webinars we will be organizing on the way to the WCC 11th Assembly in Germany in order to prepare the participants of the assembly. And this is also an occasion when we can say that, the series of webinars mark the 75th anniversary of the Church's Commission in International Affairs, commonly known as CCIA. It is also a privilege for me to introduce to you the moderator for the morning session, Reverend Philip Vinon Peacock. He is an ordained minister in the Church of North India. He was previously the associate professor in the Department of Theology, Ethics, and Social Analysis at Bishop's College, a theological college belonging to the Church of North India. He currently serves as the executive secretary for Justice and Witness for the World Communion of Reformed Churches. Over to you, Philip.
Thank you so much, Professor Isabel. And welcome to each one of you who are attending this meeting today. It is indeed a pleasure to greet you in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, who is the one we know as anti-racist. The last few weeks in international news has brought our attention to two specific events. On the one hand, we found the bodies of 215 children killed in Canada by the machinations of colonialism. On the other side of the globe, in West Papua, we continue to hear stories of human rights violations, of families running to the hills just to save themselves. And in between this vast geographical space, we know that these two events are united by what we call colonialism and imperialism. Friends, we invite you today to this first of a series of webinars that are happening across this week. Important in this current context, remembering on one hand the events of our world, the 1 year after George Floyd cried out that he cannot breathe and called for his mother, and the Black Lives protests that followed, and looking forward to the Karlsruhe Assembly next year, in which we hope that these anti-racism initiatives are placed very strongly on the agenda of the ecumenical movement in general and the World Council of Churches in particular. And to address this myriad of interconnected issues, we have today available for us a vast range of very, very talented and expert speakers. We have from Lebanon today, the Professor Dr. Nicholas Abu Murad, who holds a PhD in Biblical Studies from the University of Erlangen in Germany. He has taught biblical exegesis and ancient languages at the Orthodox University of Balamand and at various theological faculties in Lebanon and abroad. Author of several articles and studies in his areas of research, we welcome him to this webinar. We have Dr. Margaret Ernst Habib, a systematic theologian who teaches at the University of Saarland and the University of Duisburg, Essen in Germany. Her main teaching and research interests focus on the dialogue between traditional theological concepts on the one hand and contemporary challenges within a global perspective, such as feminist and post-colonial theologies on the other. She is particularly keen on theological reflections on whiteness and privilege, and on justice-related issues in general. Ernst Habib is an ordained minister of word and sacrament and understands her teaching as a service to the church informed by the witness of the church around the world. She serves as a member of the editorial board of Reformed World, a theological journal of the World Communion of Reformed Churches, who I must say is one of the best organizations. And her most current book project is titled Hopeful and Subversive, A Theology of Joy. Also joining us today is Kandi Soka de Jong, a Malawian Dutch PhD student of intercultural theology at the Protestant Theological University in Groningen, the Netherlands. She has a background in biblical studies, theology and development from the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, and African studies at Leiden University, the Netherlands. She lives with her family in the Dutch town of Alton, where her husband is a minister in the Protestant Church of the Netherlands. We have three more panelists today. Tara Tautari is the General Secretary of the Methodist Church in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And from 2001 to 2014, she worked with the World Council of Churches, focusing primarily on education and ecumenical formation. Upon her return to Aotearoa, she engaged with the local and national church as a member of the Te Taha Maori, the bicultural partner of the MCNZ. During this time, Tara also worked as the Deputy Prime Minister and Regional Ecumenical Development Minister of the coalition government. In 2020, she was appointed General Secretary, the first Maori to hold this position. Mr. Khalid Say is Maya Kachkeli from Guatemala, with experience in defending the rights of indigenous people, both in Guatemala and at the level of the United Nations and the OAS. He was founder and member of different indigenous organizations in Guatemala, as well as ambassador of Guatemala to the Federal Republic of Germany, and was president of the Committee of the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, a treaty body from which he was elected for 4 consecutive periods of 4 years each. He was Director of Human Rights at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Guatemala. He was member of the Presidential Commission Against Discrimination Against Indigenous People in Guatemala, and president of the National Reparation Program for Victims of Internal Armed Conflict. And we also have today present with us Dr. Francina Yoteni. She is senior lecturer at the Theological College in Jaipura, West Papua. She is an indigenous Papuan woman, PhD holder, teaching such subjects as peace, theology, transformation, and leadership, which combined traditional leadership styles and modern leadership styles. She also works as a consultant for the Partnership Desk and Commission of Justice, Peace, and Integrity of Creation at the GKI Synod Office. She is active in the indigenous peoples, human rights, and environmental campaigns, and she has been speaking in various local, regional, and international arenas on anti-racism from a Christian perspective. She is also a researcher for indigenous rights for education, leadership management, and higher education in Papua during the COVID-19 pandemic, and even for LGBT issues. She holds a doctorate of philosophy and educational administration from the Silliman University in Duamguete City, Negros Oriental, in the Philippines. Friends, let's take a moment to welcome each one of these extremely powerful and people who hold such deep expertise in their fields before we begin our webinar today. And now may I ask our technical administration to bring forth this image that we are looking forward to see. The image, of course, presents a divided picture. of civilization on the one hand and barbarianism on the other. I would like to ask each one of the panelists a very deeply personal yet political question. How does this image resonate historically in your context? And according to this image, are you on the side of civilization, or are you on the side of barbarism, and why? And I'd like to ask Tara to begin with this part of the conversation.
Tēnā koutou e te whānau te karaiti. Greetings to you, sisters and brothers in Christ around the world. And thank you, Philip, for your introduction and for showing us the image. It was really interesting. 3 days after I got the email with the image, a senior politician in our parliament said that on balance, Māori, Indigenous to Aotearoa, New Zealand, on balance, Māori benefited from civilization and from all the wonderful things that came to us via civilization. And he went on to say, like literacy and freedom and democracy. And so I had to laugh when this comment from one of our own parliamentarians came so quickly after receiving the image. Such is the potency of this narrative. You know, Kepler's cartoon there shows us this white Britannia in an inexorable march leading us to freedom, democracy, and progress. And for many of us on the other side, the so-called barbarians, our experience of civilization then is seen through this lens this narrative that has held sway. And although there was a lot of pushback against the words from this politician, I think what is readily understood by Māori, many Māori in Aotearoa, and many allies, is that his opinion is not a minority opinion. It's not a minority opinion. And that there is still a prevailing narrative that for us Māori here in Aotearoa, we were saved. We were saved by white Britannia and all that she brought to us. My youngest daughter, who's 14 and at high school, was in a class where they were looking at our founding document, the Treaty of Waitangi, Te Treaty o Waitangi. And in the course of the discussion, one of her classmates said to her, well, you should be thankful we're here. You should be thankful we're here. This is the power of this narrative. And whether it's coming from a senior politician who gets to decide legislation, who gets to decide power in Aotearoa, or if it's coming from a young student who still holds to this truth that we should be thankful for white presence in our land. I think on balance, Māori are still struggling with coming to terms with the trauma of this so-called inexorable march of white Britannia. And such a powerful narrative such as that does not allow for our own stories, our own histories, our own experiences to take precedence over this image. I would like to see images that we give to begin our discussions on civilization. Now, wouldn't
Thank
that
you,
be
Tara.
interesting?
Sorry.
Wouldn't that be interesting, Philip? Not to start with White Britannia, but to start with brown Maori and our image.
Excellent. And this is where I wanted to take up from. I mean, because the image is not neutral. It shows two groups of people on either side, one presenting themselves really as a savior of the other. But in that salvific moment is written in this history of violence. I would like to now turn to Thandi and ask Thandi from her mother, because Thandi has this dual experience of living in, coming from Africa and living in Europe. So from this dual experience, how do you reflect on the duality, yet the complicated relations of power that this image projects?
Thank you. Thank you, Philip.
And Thandi, I'm going to give you 2 minutes to do this, to answer this very hard question.
Oh, all right, I'll do my best. Well, as you said, I am an immigrant here in the Netherlands. I will speak about the context where I'm from originally, that is Malawi in Africa. But of course, some of the issues overlap with the experience of people of African descent here. So this image resonates with my context primarily because of slave trade and colonization. I noted that the artist was very intentional. In the group on the left, representing the civilized, we see at least several faces very clearly, all filled with purpose and resolve. We also get an idea of what their jobs are and their sacrifice in the line of duty. I think that in the eyes of this artist, my ancestors and I are part of the group on the right, which is depicted as a faceless mass with unclear facial features, except for the one in a submissive position, his face marked with what I imagine is supposed to be a senseless, desperate refusal to acknowledge that he needs to be civilized. So based on this artist's racialized gaze, I am seen as part of the faceless resisting mass, but only until I distinguish myself in a way that is consistent with his civilization. Some ways I'm expected to do this include the kind and quality of education I value, my religion or lack thereof, and related habits and so on. So I feel that each time I conform to these expectations, which I have done, both knowingly and unknowingly, I collude with the group on the left in this long history of imperial work. So for me, it is always a constant reflection on my complicity in this.
Thank you, Thandi. I would like now very much to turn to Professor Nicholas Abu Murad and particularly ask him to reflect on this image in the context of all the work that has been done around the question of Orientalism, which has also produced and reproduced such images.
I forgot to unmute. First of all, I'd like to greet you all. Happy to be with you. In fact, this question can be reflected upon on the basis of the situation in the Middle East that has been dragging for several decades. Actually, it gets a lot complicated in terms of how one would look at what is the meaning of civilization and what is the meaning of barbarism in the context of the Middle East. As a matter of fact, as you all know, this area of the world, the region of the world, is situated in what the Roman Empire at the time called civilization or oikumene. It was not situated in the areas which were labeled by the Romans as the barbarian regions. However, the contrast between civilization and barbarism in the Middle East has taken several shapes, especially after World War I and the fall of the Ottoman Empire. I would like to call this kind of, let me say, discrimination or separation between, or these two opposing mirrors, if you want, civilization and barbarism, I would like to call it as the political, as a political separation and geopolitical separation. So civilization came to the Middle East in the form of political hegemony by the powers that wanted to inherit the vastness of the Roman Empire. So it is little surprise, it comes with little surprise in our context in the Middle East, which was created in its actual shape about 100 years ago through, let me quote the famous book, or the title of the book by James Barr, A Line Drawn in the Sand, by representatives of the two competing powers at the time, Britain and France, in a secret agreement known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement to define the sphere of influence, interests, and power of each of them. In 1916, the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, a parallel disintegration was caused to affect the richly adorned tapestry of cultures, languages, and religions which coexisted and lived side by side. So civilization came in the shape of political hegemony by the Europeans, and mainly the French and the Brits, the Britain and France, and the peoples and the communities of the Middle East were looked at and dealt with as politically barbarians, in the sense that these peoples, these communities cannot rule themselves. So the vastness of what we call now Middle East was divided into competing political entities based on confessionalism and religious separation. And I think this has created the Middle East as we know it today, an area that is always burning, and the fire is fueled by confessionalism, by this separation between civilization as a political form or as a political pattern that cannot be accepted by the local communities, and also the local communities on the other hand that are seeking to understand their identity and to define their identity. So I think it is not a matter of race, it's not a matter of culture versus lack of culture, or education versus lack of education, but it is in the form of a political model imposed by France and Britain in the first place, and then also taken up by the United States at a later stage, and the disintegration of the local communities in hostile states and in hostile entities. Hello?
Sorry, we are running behind time already, and I know everyone has a lot to say about this. So I want to quickly turn to Dr. Margaret Ernst Habib and ask her, how does she reflect on this particular image? I'm going to give you 1 minute and 30 seconds and then move to the two indigenous people that we have on this panel, because I think their voices are also very important for this particular image. So first to Margaret, and then on to Dr. Francina and Jose Fernandez.
Yes, white people have spoken enough, so it's okay if I have 1 minute and 30 seconds. I do see color. I think in this picture, for me, it's important to acknowledge that I do see color, and I see color of civilization. And even though I'm not a heroic figure in any means, I see myself as embodied civilization. That doesn't mean that I think I'm civilization. It's just that I'm perceived because I'm white, because I'm German. Wherever I go, I'm embodied. I take that with me. I take this privilege with me. So for me, there's just one place in this picture, and this is the lady in the middle. This is what people this is how I'm treated. This is what I haven't earned. This is just what bodies bring with them. So it's not just about systems. It's not about philosophy and politics. It's about bodies.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Now, apart from Tara, who started with the indigenous question, we have two more indigenous people in this meeting, and I would really like to get their perspectives. First from West Papua, and then with the special rapporteur. Dr. Francina?
Thank you. Well, when I see that image, actually, well, if I reflect on what we are experiencing today here in Papua, I would like to divide actually our experience being, well, civilization or barbarism. But what we are experiencing, first period of our civilization, are the indigenous people life cycle. So we are living in connecting with our environment. We are taken gift from our environment. We are one in one cosmology. And then the second period, when we have the missionaries come to Papua, and that we are touched with what is called educational modern educational system, where we learn about our nationality and our identity from the different perspectives. And this third period of time is when Papua being colonized by Indonesia, occupied by Indonesia, where what we are seeing today, our people are dying, more soldiers. We see illegal logging. We see mining. The cause of the people dying every day. We have IDPs, indigenous people who are displaced from their own village. Even our pastors who are killed by military and without any proper things to bury their body. So these are things in this modern era, we experience this. I don't know if I categorize that as a civilization or barbarism, but this is what we are experiencing as indigenous people here in Papua. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to now move on to the special rapporteur, but ask a connected question, actually. So we'll move from the image and ask him also to reflect, what are the specific issues of colonialism that you are struggling against in your own context? So connect the image and to what's happening at present, and then we will move that way into the second question.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Peacock, and also to the World Council of Churches for inviting me this morning. You know that I'm not going to talk specifically on the image because it's the same thing that is taking place in this moment, and it's reflecting on indigenous people in this moment. Religion has been imposed to indigenous people, a language has been imposed to indigenous people, and for centuries, indigenous people have been hiding, practicing their spirituality. And if there is, and still colonialism or civilization is trying to hide the reality that they impose to indigenous people. And as you mentioned today, when you started your introduction, I am very glad that you brought it here because I was going to mention that also. The role that the church played in the colonization on indigenous people is very negatively. It's very negative. And I think that that is the thing that is reflecting in this moment in Canada, because they are not trying to give all the information to indigenous people what really took place in that moment in Canada. And that we can see what is happening in this moment. And as you know, the image is very clear. And you ask also a question, where I be reflected? Of course, I am a barbarian. I've been calling a barbarian, I've been calling an uncivilized person. I've been calling also ignorant. I've been calling many names. As a person, when I was a kid, when I was young, and now in my older age, also I've been calling in the same way. So the thing is that I'm seeing that the situation is not only my experience. That is the experience that I have seen in almost all the indigenous people that I know in this moment. So I think that we have to remember that the racism and racial discrimination, many people thought that with the fell down of the apartheid system, racism and racial discrimination disappeared. But now we know that it's not true, that the racism and racial discrimination is still alive and very, very alive. So I think that that is very important that we have to take in account. Of course, churches like that are conforming the World Council of Churches are playing a very important role for the decolonization, but also for building democracy in many countries.
Thank you so much. We move on asking the same question now to Professor Nicholas. Please use this opportunity to tell us what are the continuing issues of colonialism that you are struggling against? Professor Nicholas? Okay, I think we have some technical issues here. So may I ask that Francina begins to answer this question and see whether he comes back online shortly. Francina, could you highlight the struggles in West Papua now for us, please?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, before we receive, become a Christian, we live our ancestors live in a kind of belief that they have what is God by their image. That's why they are caring for the natures, because they believe that the image of God is there in the mountain, in the valley. That's why the Papuan believe that mountains are
Friends, I think we are suffering from certain technical issues once more, but we find that Professor Nicholas has come back, and let me ask him now to move into this question about what the contextual issues with regards to colonialism are in the Middle East at the moment.
Sorry, I was disconnected for technical problems, and it took me some time to reconnect. The main issue in the Middle East is actually the dismantling of what was called the eastern part of the Roman Empire, or the eastern part of the eastern province of the Ottoman Empire, into different political entities based on the separation or on the distribution of power and of land between the two competing powers in Europe, France and Britain. So, and this enmity or animosity at the very end of World War I between France and Britain was echoed also in the Middle East, and this has led to all the tensions that were fueled by the confessional tensions, and also by the confessional sensitivity of the communities in the Middle East. So we are now living in a broken Middle East, where people look at themselves not as citizens of the same country or as neighbors in the same region, but they look themselves as competing in terms of confessionalism. So let's talk between Muslims and Christians on one hand, but that's not the big deal. The big deal is within Islam, you have the separation between Shia and Sunnah. This separation does not only have religious implications, but it has political implications. And we look today at all the tensions between Saudi Arabia as a Sunni country and Iran as a Shia country. So this division has also echoes in Lebanon, in Syria, and Palestine, in Yemen today, in Iraq, in the different parts of the region. So Sunni and Shia, this separation that has survived for centuries without necessarily leading to violence is leading to a terrible violence nowadays, because this separation is used by the Western powers in order to enforce on the Middle East a political statu quo, which is related in a way or another to the stability of Israel. So we have always this tension that is fueled, and within Christianity, we have also the separation between Orthodox, Maronite, Catholics, Protestants. You see, and the main example is Lebanon. Lebanon being also a country with the state of which is constructed on the basis of the separation and of confessions. And the struggle of each community to have more power is leading actually to terrible crisis in the community on the level of economics, but also on the level of the welfare of the peoples in the Middle East. And I think this is where mainly in the Middle East, the impact of colonialism resonates.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to ask Tara now to wrap up this question for us about what are the issues of colonialism that you are struggling with in your context.
Thanks, Philip. To wrap it up, I think what we've all been talking about in terms of issues of colonialism is an issue of loss and dispossession and the historical trauma of that. And it's not about us looking back, it's about us experiencing such trauma to this current day. And I was helped by our special rapporteur speaking strongly about that. I was also reminded of what Tandy was saying when she questioned her own and our own complicity in this narrative. And certainly that is a key question for the church to confront itself with. And we are trying to find ways in which to have honest and courageous conversations about what this means for us. But primarily for Māori and Aotearoa, the legacy of colonialism is all about loss of land, loss of language, loss of law, loss of power base, loss of identity, loss of status. Thanks, Philip.
Thank you. We now move from the experiential of what people have experienced, how they have experienced colonialism, to perhaps a little more of a theoretical argument now. We know that decolonization has been a movement that has emerged from academy, but have also made itself out onto the streets. And I'd like to ask Sunday, as a scholar who has been working on this, to reflect to what extent has decolonization helped to dismantle racism?
Thank you. Once again, I'll speak from the perspective of my context, as far as I know. So first of all, decolonization is an ongoing process in my context. Politically, we are decolonized, but economically, culturally, and in other aspects, colonization is ongoing. And added to that is the generational trauma that comes with the experience of colonization, even if politically, colonization for us is in the past. There's a Zimbabwean author, her name is Tsitsi Dangarembwa. For example, she explores the psychological aspects that come with the emotional stress of colonization and racism, and I recognize that emotional stress in myself and others as well. There's also a relationship on the positive side. There's a relationship between, well, not on the positive side yet, sorry. There's also a relationship between colonization and patriarchy. So for sure, African societies, we had our own versions of patriarchy and sexism. However, colonialism brought with it its own brand of sexism along with racism. And that is another important aspect of colonization, among others, that needs to be dismantled alongside racism. That said, my context has come a long way. Malawi's boundaries were created at the Berlin Conference in the late 19th century. And from that time to the present, we have gained our independence and successfully removed some of the barriers that stood in the way of self-governance. And these include the racial barriers that, for example, kept Black Malawians out of good or higher education, restricted our rights to land and property, and leadership in church and society. We have also witnessed the development of transnational dialogue between formerly colonized people and people of African descent in the diaspora outside the racist gaze. And these are some of the important steps in the ongoing work of dismantling racism.
Thank you very much, Thande. I think you've also raised this very important question about how our own indigenous, perhaps, systems of oppression have been appropriated and manipulated by colonialism itself to form new forms of oppression for our people. I'd like to now pass the mic on to Tara to reflect on this question from her perspective. And then to Margaret, who's also been doing work on this entire decolonization project.
Yeah, maybe it's better to hear from Francina, Philip. I mean, I'm happy to speak, but our sister got cut in the last segment. She might have something to say.
Tara, why don't you go ahead and then we will come back to Francina because she has another part coming in now.
I mean, I think your assessment is correct. And the only observation I would make is that for Māori to talk about the own way we then oppress using colonial constructs, our own, that's the conversation we have in-house. And it's not something that we freely, I mean, it's interesting, you know, and I'll give you a concrete example. So at a WCC meeting in Bahia, we, Indigenous group, we met with the women's group at the time, and as Indigenous young women, we were told you need to support women's cause, yeah? And yet for Indigenous women there, our greatest cause was sovereignty. That was our only cause, but that caused a huge problem within the group. Now, it's very interesting to reflect on that. What does that mean in terms of our own decolonization processes, our own ability to reach out and to encounter each other and to make critical partnerships of solidarity? But I think when it comes to Indigenous people, at least from Māori, that's the conversation we have in-house. And that's something we navigate and negotiate amongst our own. It would be interesting to see if other Indigenous peoples do it in the same way.
Thank you. Margaret, on to you, and how would you reflect on this entire project of decolonization?
I think the biggest challenge for us is decolonizing our minds, because that's like the first step in taking action, in taking up responsibility, in changing or getting at our privilege, because that's not common understanding. We don't know what whiteness means. We don't know what comes with whiteness. We don't know what white privilege is, because we are the norm. We are good people. We are not racist. We don't see color. We want the best for everybody. We don't see how we do construct the world and have the power to enforce this construction in theology, in politics, in economics, in every part. because we just don't see who we are and what power we carry. So for us, decolonizing our mind, especially in theology, in philosophy, starts with understanding how we construct our own identities. We see ourselves as, you know, heirs of the Enlightenment, rational people, but we don't see that for identifying us as this, Enlightenment has had to use other races, had to invent other races. So we only understand ourselves, even if we don't know that any longer, over against other people who are not on the other side, but beneath us in every part. So dismantling racism for me starts, for me in my church, with my students, starts at trying to find out what whiteness means and what all comes with this whiteness. As I said in the picture, I carry this whiteness with me. I have this privilege all the time. And starting here needs to start by decolonizing our minds. And that's a huge challenge, because Germans think we don't have anything to do with colonialisms because we just had so few colonies and we were not a huge colonial power. So that's actually no longer our question. We are not responsible for that. And the mindset, the rational Enlightenment mindset, which is based on racism, is just beginning to take, you know, a role in discussions here. So yeah, decolonization is decolonizing the mind.
Thank you so much. And to bringing that aspect of it also, I want to now wrap up this initial session by asking the special rapporteur to focus on this question of decolonization, after which we will have 2 questions that have been asked, and I will present them to the speaker and then go to Francina to pick up from where she left off. Yes, special rapporteur, how do you think about this decolonization project?
Well, I am agree with Margaret because I think that the worst part of the colonization is our own mind. And even we, the indigenous people, we have to decolonize our mind and our way of thinking, because it's as with many times indigenous people feel that is common. Is every day that the discrimination, racial discrimination, and the oppression has been every day that is say, oh, okay, that is common. It's because we are indigenous. So what we have to do is to decolonize our mind, and then we are going to see that the decolonization of indigenous people is very strong link with the decolonization of the Black people, of the African people. And I think that that is the way that we have to see it, because it's very important. We took as example the African struggle to start the decolonization and the struggle of the decolonization of our people as indigenous peoples.
Thank you so much. We will now break not break away from the meeting, but break into asking questions that have appeared in the chat box. And the first is a very interesting question that we have from Andrew Glenn from Australia, who says, along with the notion of the invasion of the civilizing Europeans is the notion that God came along with them. In other words, that God was absent before the white invaders arrived. He goes on to say that the Uniting Church in Australia has specifically denied this in its constitution. Do you believe that as followers of Christ, we must change the imperialist view of God coming with the invaders? Now, I want to begin this question with Tara, because I know that she feels very strongly about this, but then move to the special rapporteur, and finally to Francisa to answer this particular question. But very, very quickly, please.
Yes, I believe that we need to change this imperialist view that God came with the invaders. God was with us well before them. But what's interesting to me, Philip, and I just want to say it quickly, it doesn't matter if you change it in your constitution, actually. It matters about how you live that out, sharing resources, sharing power in the structures of the church. That's how you embody God amongst you. And I think that's the challenge for churches who have gone far, but have still further to go.
Thank you. a special rapporteur, you had said that actually Christianity is part of the problem. So would you like to say more about this now?
Well, when I said that it was part of the problem, and many of the churches are still part of the problems in this moment. But fortunately, the majority of the churches have been decolonized themselves also, and they have been helping indigenous people to support the struggle of indigenous peoples. And that is very important to take in account, because I believe that you have to remember that when the invaders came to our lands, they said that they brought God and Christ. So everything that is not a Christian is a devil religion. So that's why they have to destroy those. And still today, there are many churches in Latin America and other parts of the world that is still destroying sacred sites of indigenous people. And I think that that is something that we have to understand, but it's not the traditional churches. There are some of the, how do you say it, is evangelical sects that have been born in the decade of the 80s. Of the last century. So that is a big difference between the traditional churches and the new churches that have been born in the 80s.
Thank you. Francina.
Yeah, thank you. What I can say about this is first, for Papua situation, it's really political situation. And when we talk about decolonization, the people here, I mean, in this country have decolonized their mindset. So because the mental of colonialism and racism and discrimination, it's absorbed to the peoples in the different level, in the political level where decision making was taken. That's why they are avoid to sit when the indigenous Papuan are talking about the dialogue about the situation in Papua. They are avoid this approach. And another things that I have to witness that the good news, the Bible is teaching good things for us. I mean, and we as indigenous Papuan today, we can stand on this hopeless situation. It's because we believe in God. The God that we understand through the Christian, but the God also that we understand from ourselves as the indigenous Papuan. That's why when we pray in our mother tongue. That's we feel very strong. And today, all the women are bend their knee, do fasting and pray for the situation where we are in today. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that highlights really the big ambiguous promise of the church and of Christianity. On the one hand, it comes with colonialism, but those who come from oppressed communities have appropriated this gospel to give new meaning to the struggles that they are in. We have one more question from Nishad Isaac Chande, who asks this question very specifically to Dr. Margaret. And he asked us, does post-colonial ecumenism play an important role in promoting intersections between cultures, which can promote celebration of both the oppressor and the oppressed?
Yes, certainly. I think post-colonial ecumenism is key because what I learned from brothers and sisters from around the world, not from inside myself, or discussion from people inside myself. So that's it's major thing, and that's what we need in churches and in the universities, and I think that's what we are grateful for too. I have a little bit of a problem with the last part, with the promotion from promoting celebration of both the oppressor and the oppressed. Yeah, I don't want to be celebrated. As first, I understand the question, and I think it's important. Post-colonialism also gives us a chance, as Letty Russell used to say, to see that we're sitting in the same boat, and there are so many different intersectional connections. And I'm not in the same position as a white male theologian here in Germany. I'm not, but on a global level, I'm in an absolute situation of privilege. So what we're maybe celebrating is being human together and learning from each other, even though that's also not a yeah, an even weighted thing. So the celebration part is a little bit hard for me, but I do think it's if we want to come forward in all those questions concerning post-colonial responsibility from our perspective, we need post-colonial encounters. Otherwise, it's not working. We cannot do that inside our own heads. So thank you for
Thank
that
you, Margaret.
question.
Two more questions have appeared in the chat box. Thank you very much for them. We will return to them. But I really want to go to my fourth question now at the moment. How do you name whiteness in this discussion of colonialism and racism? And how might whiteness and white privilege be dismantled? And of course, I'm going to give Margaret the last word on this, but let's start with Francina. Francina, you were cut off earlier, so if you can bring part of that, your context back in now, and then tell us about this entire question of whiteness and how do we deal with it?
Well, I would like to respond to this question with this. When I see somebody as he or she, I place myself different. But when I see somebody as myself, then I will treat her, I will treat him different because I put him or her as me. So I don't see somebody there and not me. That's make differences. That's what happening today here in Papua context. But when we see, that's what Papuans see. We see the migrant, we see the foreigners come to us as a brother and sister. That image is well placed in our minds. But when we see somebody's different, then we already make separation. We do discriminations. That's what happening today here. I cannot say whiteness because what we are experiencing here, I cannot say this kind of whiteness because there is a brownness also, brown color. So whiteness, brown, and what? So there are the concept of this. So for us here, what is really triggered for what we are experiencing today, human rights abuses that we are experiencing today, I think it's because of economic reasons. That's drive things. Also because when people are seeing us not as a human being in this modern era in 21st century, when they see you, it's very below, then they treat you just as what they think. Thank you.
Thank you very much, actually, for bringing this economic part to the question of racism. We somehow separate these two, but to see how economics engages with the question of racism is extremely important. I will now ask Professor Nicholas to speak to us for a few minutes, 2 minutes, on how would you name whiteness in this discussion of colonialism and racism?
Actually, the problem with the church, or the idea of the church, or all the theology that accompanied the colonial powers or the white peoples in their invasion of other continents and the imposition of their religion, as well as their way of thinking, and probably also the infiltration of racism into the relationship between people. I think that the problem of that church was that that church has as a biblical model the elected people, but did not have as a biblical model something that the whole idea of elected people is based upon, and that's the very short and sometimes for some trivial story of Cain and Abel, the white and the non-white, the possessor and the poor, the owner of land versus the nomad, actually the one who wants to have God for him only versus the one who was excluded from every connection and relationship with God. I think this model is the basis for any theology that is related to the elected people. The elected people in the Old Testament, which was used as a model by so many powers, and especially colonial powers, is something that has to be interpreted on the basis of the fact that the elected for God in the Bible is the one that was rejected by man and not the man who rejected others. So that's very important. And I think whiteness is a misrepresentation of the biblical teaching. It's actually a proof, on the other hand, that the Bible is correct and that there is always a white, quote unquote, who persecutes others. There is always a white Cain who kills his brother because the brother is not privileged, because the brother is barbarian, because the brother is someone who competes with him. Yet God has chosen the barbarian. And from the line of the barbarian, we have Jesus Christ. So the Jesus Christ comes from the line of the one who was rejected and not the one who rejected. So actually, it is a model for us that we have to take into serious consideration when we have to deal with the main question that you asked in your note paper, in your concept paper, that how do we repent? I think we repent by going back to the roots, by going back to see how the Bible dismantles and deconstructs whiteness, deconstructs colonialism, and how the elected in the Bible is the rejected by man. So God's elected is man's rejected. So this model has to be somewhere in our theologies. And I think this is something that we have totally forgotten in our way of dealing with others throughout centuries.
Thank you so much. Margaret, now, on this whole question of whiteness and white privilege that you have been working on.
Yeah, and I wish I could answer those questions because we're just at the beginning working on that. Well, it's a huge question. I would like to share something with you again on the embodiedness of whiteness. My husband is a Palestinian. We have 3 children, a daughter who looks very much like her Mediterranean relatives, and 2 sons who look like, I don't know, German-born, blonde-eyed, blonde hair, blue-eyed people, and I can already see right now how people are reading them. My daughter is read as an immigrant. My sons are not. My sons are read as in our society in Germany. So how do we dismantle this kind of racism they are experiencing? Children of the same parents, born in the same place. I think what Professor Abu Mat just said is we need to go back and try to see this also through a theological and biblical sense, because what I think what whiteness is at the heart of it, it's a sin. It's a sin which is not an individual sin, but it's a structural sin. What we have learned from liberation theology, there are sins which play themselves out not only in people's hearts and minds, but in structures, in understanding, in systems, in the economy, in politics, in everything, in how we see the world. And for me, to dismantle racism, as I said before, is to start right here, to understand that whiteness, which gives us privilege, those of us who are white everywhere all the time, it needs to be understood and confessed as a sin. And only from there we can try to repent and rework and accept forgiveness which is sometimes also offered to us. But before we do this step, I think it's only we're only working on little pieces and parts, and don't really change our ways of being and thinking.
Right. Thank you so much. We are now going to move into our last question. And I think something that resonated very strongly, at least with me, was the experience that Tara had when she said they were called into this women's conference, but the most important point on the indigenous women's agenda was the question of sovereignty. We have different groups of people who have different struggles. Yet, if we have to make another world possible, somehow there should be questions of alliance building, solidarity, interconnectedness. And so I'm going to ask each one of the participants very, very quickly, and I must insist on this because we are running out of time. What are the interconnected struggles in your context given colonialism? And we will start with Margaret and then move on to the others.
The main struggle for us is this kind of whataboutism. So you raise one question, you point out one thing, and the immediate response is what about, in my context. So if I talk about whiteness, what about poor people in Germany, or what about this? So what the problem is that we have this interconnectedness of all these issues, and there are people who have the benefits of this, but how to point out at the same time the interconnectedness, but also privilege one discussion at a moment, because I don't think the term intersectionality actually works, because it feels like there's an intersection where those people meet, but it's much more like entanglement. Everything is interwoven in each other. So I'm also a feminist theologian. How do I bring that forward? I found that story very helpful in seeing like white feminists demanding solidarity from indigenous people and calling for them to be to do what we think is the most part. But how am I a feminist theologian, a post-colonial theologian at the same time, and also one who is working in her theology for refugees in Germany? So that's my major problem in saying that this is not just an intersection. Everything is interwoven in each other, and how to work with this, I haven't found out yet.
Tande, how would you look at this question?
I think in my context, one of the things is over time you internalize you know, all these effects, and you ask yourself, are you good enough? or as a nation, you ask yourself, are we good enough? With the history of eugenics, for example, there's this idea that, you know, if you're African, you're not smart enough. With the erasure of our histories, you have this idea, you know, over time as you're growing, that our history, like for me, for example, with the schools that I was sent to, I learned a lot about Western history, but not as much about my own history. And I had to make extra effort to learn as much as I needed about my own history. So I think one of the bigger issues is, you know, when people, not that they believe it, but they internalize those questions, am I good enough? It does stifle how people see progress and how they can do things for themselves. But even theologically, if as an African church or as a Malawian church, you hear certain things that are said in passing, like, oh, but the African church is 2 inches deep, you know, of course it's an excuse, you know, for this creation of a dependence on missions. But at the same time, it does hinder the work of the Spirit, in my view, in the African church, because people begin to look down upon themselves. So I think, yeah, some of our interconnected struggles come with that idea that has been implanted, and it still needs to continue to be decolonized. That are we good enough? Am I good enough? It's not true that we're not good enough, but it's there, I would say.
Thank you, thank you. Dr. Francina?
Thank you. There is a saying here in Papua by one of our very famous missionary here, that saying that the Papuan will stand up and lead themselves. And today, when we reflect on our situation, when we are hoping other people are decolonized themselves, we decolonize ourselves also on this situation. And we are trying to be strong enough today to stand by our own struggle, even though imagine we are already 50 years under this colony, and we are traumatized so much. There are women who are pregnant because of their military abuses, sexual abuses. And there are people on the jungle today who have nothing to wear and eat because they become internal displaced people who are on the cave, on the jungle, and they have to walk miles and miles away from their own village. And they have to adapt to the new environment. And with a very short time or period, this is impossible for somebody to survive. But this is the reality, thousands of people today in Papua. But we still, as I tell you, that we still have that power in our heart, that if we are still here, standing in our own land, we believe that we will be blessed because of this. And one thing is that the church are standing with the people and raise up their voice, even though because of this, they are being stamped, being stamped as a separatism. But this is the cost, that if you are standing with the people, you will carry that cross also in your shoulder. But we believe on this. We will one day, we will be a winner on this very, very strong pressure that we as a Papuan today have. And I would like to also take this opportunity to raise that Papua situation, Papua political struggle, it's international struggle, should be brought on the international level, international thought, international discussion. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Francina. We move on to our next person, and I will ask the special rapporteur to answer this question.
Well, I think that one way is to recognize self-determination of indigenous people, autonomy, the previous consultation and informed consultation, allow indigenous people to speak their own language, to practice their own culture, to have their own identity, to practice their own spirituality, to respect their rights, and to recognize their land, territories, to practice their self-determination. And I think that is my answer in this moment.
Thank you so much. We have two more panelists to answer this question. First, Dr. Nicholas, and then, of course, we'll go to Tara, who asked the question in a different way at the beginning, and I'd like her to sum up this part.
So it's my turn now. Hello?
Yes, it is your turn.
I think that the main struggle in the Middle East is how to understand plurality and identity, how to bring together these two notions into a symbiosis. The problem of identity in the Middle East is very crucial, and it's also dangerous in a lot of its implications. So talking about plurality and identity and how identity can encompass also a pluralistic dimension is a very important topic. And I think it's something that is worth being considered by the inhabitants of this region of the world, the Middle East. It is something that is all but uncomplicated and tricky. especially in a context where identities, dear friends, and the need to belong to something have become regretfully destructive factors. So identity has become a destructive factor in the Middle East. To adapt, I don't know if you know the French Lebanese author Amin Maalouf and his very famous expression, les identités meurtrières, the murderous identities or the killing identities. So nationalistic movements and ideas in the Middle East, such as the late 19th century Pan-Arabism and the mid-20th century Syrian nationalism, trans-border political movements within the countries of the Middle East, such as Ba'athism in Syria and Iraq, and the attempt at Arab union between Syria and Egypt in the 70s or 60s, were all failed or were all caused to fail for several reasons and through various internal and external forces. So even as in Lebanon, for example, and Iraq, the confessional or denominational assertiveness on the part of the different communities and the religious components of the Middle Eastern societies did not prove to be helpful, but on the contrary, it increased tensions and escalated into confessional violence, as in Iraq, and negative competition and mafia-like corruption, as in my country, Lebanon. So I think these are issues that we have to deal with, issues that we have not to wait for others to tell us what to do, but we have to start shaping our identity in our mind in a way that others would be also included despite their otherness, despite their differences. This is what could lead this region to peace. This is what could lead this region into coexistence and true living together between the different entities that have long made a rich tapestry, cultural tapestry in the Orient.
Thank you. And Ms. Tatar will now, hello. I think once more, Nicholas, you're having some technical issues. We missed the last part of what you said. But
hello. Yeah, I think I have an unstable internet connection, unfortunately. But okay. Could you hear the whole thing, everything I said?
We heard most of it. Could you summarize your last sentence?
Okay. Yes, what I said is that the challenges, the struggle that we have to deal with is how to rely on ourselves, actually. And here I would like also to thank the honorable guests who also spoke before me on this issue, who said that we have to learn on how to deal with matters. We have to rely on ourselves in shaping our identity and not waiting for others to impose on us on a model, because this will never function. We have also to try to be independent in taking decisions that affect our countries, affect our communities, in a way that could lead us to peace and not to confrontation. And I'm talking here frankly about the relationship between the Arabs and Israel on one hand, but also among the Arabs you have Shia and Sunni, and you have also the question of the non-Arab Islam, the Shia Islam in Iran. These are things that have terrible impact on our everyday life in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, throughout the Middle East in general. So we are dealing with identité meurtrière. We are dealing truly with a murderous way of shaping our own identities. And this is something that we have to bring to closure by really turning to the values of Islam, to the values of Christianity, where the other becomes always the revelation of the true God and the revelation of the face of God, despite the differences.
Thank you. That is brilliant. Tara, will you please wrap up the session for us with your words of wisdom coming out of these years of experience that you've had?
Look, I would only say, having listened to everyone and really agreeing with all that has been said, is that you can have all the theory and all the words, the language, the in-language of whiteness, or whatever word we're using this time, interconnectedness, and with whatever it is, you can have it all. But if you don't have relationship, you can forget about it. You can forget about it, absolutely. If there is no relationship between you and another person, between you and another group of people, you can just forget about it. And I think it is that forging, that building, that navigating your way to nurturing a relationship, that is the only way that we can push through on these issues. And in that vein, it's almost a very hard thing to be on this medium, such as Zoom, because the relationship is not here. We have the beginnings, but we don't have that which pulls me to Francina, which pulls me to Maggie, etc., etc. And so I think my wish and my greatest desire is for us to be able to talk about these issues in a way that pulls us together in relationship with each other. That's all I have to offer you, Philip. Sorry.
No, but that is extremely beautiful and powerful, and that is really what we are all about. Friends, in the question and answer, we've had a whole spate of questions. Many of them theological questions, asking about contextual theology, indigenous theology, supersessionism, all of these things. The back-end team has, however, condense these questions, not asking the theological ones, but really I mean, of course, what Tara said was deeply, deeply theological, but for us to be able as a church to listen to the outside voice. And I'm going to ask a special rapporteur now to wind up this entire session by offering us last words by doing it through answering this question. And the question is, the process of decolonization is different for the colonizers and for the victims of colonization. How can the church and the ecumenical movement offer us a space to do this in tandem?
Well, I think that it's different. It's a big difference between the colonizer and the people who have been colonized. But the thing is that it has not been, or it's not possible to do it by each one separated. I believe that they have to be together, has to be a dialogue, but a true dialogue with everything on the table, not hiding anything, with the truth, if we wanted to have reconciliation. That is one of the things. And the other is that I believe that the church has been playing a very important role on the decolonization. And I believe also that the church, for many times, and that's why I know the World Council of Churches, because when Eugenio Poma was working with you there in the 80s, he opened the door to indigenous peoples. So I believe that now there are not too many indigenous people around the World Council of Churches, and I believe that that is something that you have to restart to do it. So then the alliance between indigenous people and churches is going to continue, and is going to strengthening the decolonization.
Thank you very much. Friends, we have come to the end of an extremely exciting and informative webinar. Many questions were raised, many more questions remain to be answered. Let me just highlight two things for you. In a few hours' time, we will have a second webinar on the same questions with a different set of panelists. And if you'd like to attend those, let me invite you to do that as well. I'm sure that will be far more exciting than this. Secondly, tomorrow, we interrogate the question of the mission agencies and the legacies of mission in perpetrating this sin and heresy called colonialism. So we invite you back at the same time tomorrow to attend this webinar. the session for the e-conference for this time zone will happen at the same time. Thank you very much for your participation. We will see you tomorrow. My apologies if I have offended anyone in the course of this conversation. God's blessings to you, and please go with the spirit that calls us to resist. Thank you.
Thank you.